Legislature is back in session. We finished all the bills. We are now in resolutions, and Senator Nicholas, you have 2 resolutions on the agenda, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a motion to place Resolution 76-34 on the 3rd reading file and be offered an opportunity to speak on the measure.
Hearing no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Resolution 76-34 is relative to respectfully requesting that Congresswoman Madeline Z. Bordallo pursue via the United States Treasury and the Department of Interior a payment schedule for Section 30 reimbursements that will improve the Government of Guam's cash flow position by amortizing such payments in quarterly installments over the fiscal year, beginning with the 3rd quarter of fiscal year 2017. Before I proceed, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the timing of the resolution and the current place that we are in the fiscal year, I would like to first begin by making an amendment so that the timing of the resolution is more properly reflected with where we are right now in the fiscal year. So if I may begin by making an amendment to change fiscal year 2017 to fiscal year 2018. On the title.
On that amendment, any objection? Hearing none.
And similar, Mr. Speaker, on page 2, line 2, changing it from fiscal year 2017 to fiscal year 2018.
On that amendment on page 2, we're on Resolution 76, colleagues. Changing it to 2018. Any objection?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to begin, Mr. Speaker, by explaining the purpose of this resolution and how it's intending to help our situation here with respect to our budgeting and our cash flow. Right now, Section 30 money comes in one big lump sum at the end of the fiscal year for the next fiscal year. And so we're anticipating to bring in about $70 million on the last week of September. And the purpose of that money is it's supposed to be a big chunk of cash that we dole out over the course of the remaining 12 months of the ensuing fiscal year. Unfortunately, what happens is oftentimes that big chunk of cash gets used to pay down prior year obligations. But we're still budgeting that cash as if we were going to have it for the fiscal year. And so this resolution is intending to break that big chunk into quarterly installments to make sure we actually have the cash for the fiscal year as opposed to it getting completely depleted before the fiscal year even starts. What we have, Mr. Speaker, is a very classic example of how budgeting and cash flow are not reconciling. We're budgeting the money, but the cash flow is coming in even before the budget is passed, and it's getting spent before the budget is passed. And so what we're seeking to do is simply adjust the cash flow. And let me put it into context. In our budget, we receive funding from a variety of sources. At the federal level, we receive income taxes, we receive withholding taxes, we receive corporate income taxes. At the local level, we receive gross receipts taxes, and we receive property taxes. We also receive Section 30 money from the federal government. All of this money comes in at different times throughout the year. Income taxes usually come in around May. Withholding taxes are supposed to be paid on a bi-weekly basis with the withholding from the employees' paychecks. Gross receipts taxes come in monthly. Property taxes come in February and in May. And Section 30 money comes in as a big chunk in September. Because we have different cash flow, the ability for this government to be able to meet its obligations ebbs and flows depending on where we are in the year and where that cash flow is at. But it does not affect how we budget. If we look at every single budget that we've passed in the legislatura, you will not see a budget that reflects cash flow. You will see a budget that simply reflects the amounts that are anticipated for the fiscal year. So when money comes in on a monthly basis for GRT, for example, it provides for a more steady stream of cash for the government to operate. But when money comes in only February or May for property taxes, it creates dry spells for all the time in between. For Section 30 money, when it all comes in one big chunk, it means that if it's all spent in advance, then we're going to have a dry spell for the next 12 months. And that dry spell, Mr. Speaker, is something that we've been suffering from for many years already. Section 30 money coming in as cash will get spent, but it will still be budgeted for as if it was still there, only to find over the course of the fiscal year that that shortfall constricts the cash flow of the government to a point where we begin taking from other sources. We begin taking from other sources in order to allow for that cash flow shortage to be smoothed out so that the obligations can still be met. And so we run into the classic struggle of, do we use money to pay for operations and payroll, or do we use money to put it into the tax refund account? Because ultimately what we are doing is we're taking the tax refund money, and instead of depositing it into the account so that the money is there when it's time to pay refunds, we're using it to pay operations. And then once we get around to the end of the fiscal year, when this big chunk of change comes in, then we play catch-up with all the taxpayers. What this resolution will do is it will break the Section 30 money up into quarterly installments. It will not change in any way how we budget, because just like we receive cash from various sources at different times, by changing the time we receive Section 30 from one big lump sum into a quarterly installment, it does not change the way we budget at all. What it does change is when that cash flow is available. And by breaking it into quarterly installments, we will ensure that cash flow is available for the fiscal year in which it is intended. Because right now, we're spending it all for prior year, but we're budgeting it as if it's still there. And so, if we pass Resolution 76-34, it will take a very big step towards smoothing out our cash flow for what we anticipate we're bringing in for a fiscal year, so we're not going to have these shortfalls that are causing us to take tax refund money and use it to operate. If the Section 30 money was there, we wouldn't be doing that. And so what I'm hoping we can do is pass this resolution seeking a change in how we receive the actual cash from the federal government, so that instead of it being one big lump sum that's getting spent all up front, it's broken out into quarterly installments so we can make sure the money is there for the year in which it is intended. By doing that, we will solve a dramatic cash flow problem that we have, that will in turn solve many issues that we have in this government with not having the cash on hand to pay obligations, whether it's to our vendors, to our agencies, and most importantly to our taxpayers. So I humbly ask my colleagues to please join me in supporting Resolution 76-34 and putting forward a very clear solution to the cash flow problems of this government with respect to how we budget for the fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. On the main motion, Resolution 76-34, any senator wish to be heard? Any senator wish to be heard? Senator Torres.
Mr. Speaker, I question whether this resolution is even ripe for our consideration, because in looking at the committee report, there really was no feedback whatsoever from the government agencies that manage the cash of the government. And while we can theorize about what we believe is the ideal scenario in terms of cash flow or cash availability, in terms of installments, I think that how the government manages its money can best be articulated by the people who are entrusted with that very function. And so while I aspire to be supportive of all the members of this body, I question whether, in fact, without any feedback from those agencies that would have a very clear indication of whether this is advantageous to them or disadvantageous to them, it's really hard for us to make a decision about, whether we want to try to compel someone to someone being the Congresswoman through her office to compel her to pursue with the U.S. Treasury and the Department of Interior a payment schedule. And so I just, perhaps I would like if the author, the mover of this resolution would yield to the question. My question would be, how do you move forward when the very parties that you're seeking to help don't have an opinion one way or the other about whether this measure is worth pursuing or not?
Do you yield, Senator?
I do, Mr. Speaker. This is a conversation that I don't like to have, because it's not, it's not really, how do I say this? It just doesn't come across well, but in light of the question being asked, I think it's necessary. And the answer, Mr. Speaker, is that politics really just gets in the way of us doing what's right. If I don't toe the line with what the administration wants me to do, they're not going to have their directors come down and testify for the measures that I introduce. Or they will make sure they come down and testify negatively for the measures that I introduce. So while I am very confident that this is clearly a cash flow solution, I'm not so confident as to whether or not I'm going to ever get any kind of favorable testimony for something like this. But that being said, it behooves us as colleagues to be able to evaluate the proposition and to listen to the merits of the arguments that are presented, and to evaluate also whether or not this really will be a solution for a current and outstanding problem. We have heard testimony on other measures from officials within this government when it comes time to do other things that they are in favor of. For example, when it comes time to take out a tax refund anticipation note or a TRAN in order to borrow for tax refund, all of a sudden we will see a lot of testimony and a lot of participation. So it really underscores a very sad state of affairs when we can come in and get the testimony that we need for things that are of a shared interest, but we cannot get testimony or facts when it's something that might not necessarily be a shared interest. That being said, I'm confident that this resolution will really solve a cash flow problem with respect to our Section 30 money. When that money comes in and gets spent before the fiscal year even starts, it's no wonder we're short. I mean, that's pretty plain. And I don't think I need an agency director to come in and tell me that that is actually correct. If the money comes in and is spent before the fiscal year starts, it's gone, which means that we're going to be short that amount over the remaining 12 months. And so in order for us to fix this, we need to make sure the cash is going to be there when it is intended to be there. And we can either ask the federal government to give us a daily allotment, or we can kind of simplify it and make it quarterly. I would recommend quarterly. I think that will ensure the money is going to be there when we need it. And then we'll see a lot of things change. We'll see agencies have the money to make their payments to vendors as opposed to waiting for an allotment to be released. And more importantly, we will see taxpayers be able to get money for their tax refunds because the money will be there on a quarterly basis. It'll be there in December, it'll be there in April, and they'll be able to pay out refunds faster because the money is actually there. So I really hope that my colleagues can look past the fact that sometimes politics really just gets in the way of the measures that we're trying to move forward. But it should not be a standard for us to expect that everybody's going to agree. Ultimately, it's up to us to be able to present the solutions, weigh them, and determine whether or not we're going to support them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Morrison, just a second. Senator Camacho Torres, does that address your concern?
Well, the answer is what I expected, but it doesn't necessarily mean that going it alone is the right way if you don't have the confidence that it is the popular or the overwhelming consensus. And I think that was my position. I'm not saying that I'm adverse to the resolution. I'm just thinking that sometimes when you go down a path, unless you're absolutely sure, tread lightly, because now you're involving 3 different offices. You're involving the Congresswoman's office, you're involving the Department of the Interior, and you're involving the U.S. Treasury. So, I mean, that's just my point, you know, is at what point is it, would a phone call as opposed to a body adopting a formal resolution by a majority vote be the operative act? And just my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Morrison, you're recognized. Yes, Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the concerns of the previous speaker, and you know, I'm going through the committee report and, you know, seeing clearly there is no information there to work with. I mean, at least to the point where at least the Congresswoman's office could at least provide some feedback that we can't get these agencies to provide some testimony. Mr. Speaker, for the person that has been working these budgets for many years and understands the budget, you know, I'm looking through the checklist and seeing that it's checked off that there clearly there's no as the author referred to, there's no impact on the budgets. But I'd like to hear that, if possible, from the chair who handles the budget. I'm not sure if this was checked off by OFB, or it was checked off by CORE, or checked off by the chairman of, or the former chairman of the Committee on Rules. So, you know, there's, as the previous speaker mentioned, a lot of key folks that we needed to provide feedback on this resolution didn't come to the table, neither any feedback from the Congresswoman's office. And I just want to know, at least for the body and the person in charge of handling the budget, you know, and looking at the checklist saying that's not applicable, I believe it's applicable and should know that what's the impacts to the budget.
I'll take Senator Esteves, and then I may address that in I'll come down.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to rise in opposition to this resolution. While I'm trying my very best to understand the intent, which I take it as to split the Section 30 funds into quarterly installments for the pursuant fiscal year, or the fiscal year coming up, because we have a tendency within government to spend it on the prior fiscal year. Okay, I get it. But what I don't understand is how the reason they're spending it on the previous fiscal year for prior obligations is because there's a need to spend that money on prior obligations. And what this resolution, as I read it, does not address is how those prior obligations magically disappear. And that all of a sudden, what we owe from the previous fiscal year just goes away. And then now we can start fresh in the new coming quarters with 4 amortized payments over each quarter. But what I have the biggest problem with is, as I'm reading this, is the assertion that the people of Guam and the government of Guam can't even manage our own cash. That we have to run to the federal government to do it for us. Like children receiving allowances. And on principle alone, I can't support that. I can't support that ideal whatsoever. If there are issues, and since there are issues with cash management and cash flow, those are the issues we need to address as a government, as an island, and as a people. Not running to the king across the sea to do it for us because we're incompetent, because we're unable, or any slew of reasons we want to paint ourselves with to be unable to manage our own cash with Section 30 money that is rightfully due to the people of Guam. So again, I must rise in opposition to this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. On the resolution, Speaker Cruz, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I really didn't want to be roped into this, but the question was posed to the Chair of Appropriations. And the sponsor was correct that the entire amount is received in September. But if you go through the CRER, every month there is a line that says Section 30, and it's 1/12 of whatever that amount was. And the sponsor was correct that that money may not be there because it's already been spent in September. And it's not budgetary, but cash management issues. In September, we also have issues of paying the COLA and some other things that take huge chunks of money that's necessary at that time. I'm not saying either way, but the question was the budgetary impact. And there is no budgetary impact because the 78 or the 108, whatever the number that was going to go into Section 30, is included in the budget, and it is projected revenue. But the sponsor is correct that throughout the year, the CRER allocates 1/12 of that amount, whether or not it's still available, or it should have been available for that month. I hope that answers your question, Senator Morris.
On the resolution, is there anyone else who wants to speak on the resolution? Senator Nicholas, you may close.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. When it comes to budgeting and meeting the priorities in this government, we oftentimes find ourselves in a unique situation because of the separation of powers. The legislative branch controls the budget, they appropriate, but the executive branch controls the cash. And in circumstances where timing is involved, if cash becomes available prior to the expiration of a fiscal year, that cash can be used for that fiscal year. And therein lies the historic problem with our Section 30, because it comes in just before the end of the fiscal year, which means that the executive branch can use that cash for that fiscal year, even though the money being provided by the federal government is expressly stipulated for the ensuing fiscal year to come. It behooves us to ensure that the integrity of the budget that is within this realm of government actually has the money that is intended to go into it. Section 30 money is budgeted for the fiscal year to come. The cash comes in the fiscal year prior. This resolution will solve that problem. It will reinforce and protect the integrity of our budgets, and it will create a dramatic improvement in the availability of cash for us to be able to meet our obligations in the fiscal year to come. Now the question becomes, well, what about those prior year obligations? You know, one of the retiring speakers brought up, well, how are we going to pay for that? The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that this government has a collection problem on top of its spending problem. And that, again, is a function of the executive branch. I need to make that very clear. Not picking on the executive branch, but it is their duty in their respective branch of government to collect the taxes. When I was chair of Finance and Taxation several terms ago, when I first came into office, we held a series of oversight hearings on the Department of Revenue and Taxation about their collections behavior. At the time when I held those hearings, we were $130 million behind in collections. By bringing those issues to surface, by having many oversight hearings and following up on the collection behavior, we were able to bring that amount from 130 down to 100 million. A $30 million improvement in our collections. Today, Mr. Speaker, it has been testified by the Director of Revenue and Taxation that we are behind $150 million in collections. That's an $80 million turnaround from where we were able to get it at when it was down to 100 million. Interestingly, 80 million is just about what we bring in Section 30. If we want to pay our prior year, our current year obligations, bump up the collections. And you know, when we talk about this, oftentimes we get the feedback of, oh, well, you know, you need to appropriate us more money so we can go and do it. No, we don't. We just need to enforce, again, a function of the executive branch. They just need to enforce the collection laws. And I say this to people, whoever I speak to about this, and I'm like, you know, the governor is the tax commissioner of the territory. By law, under the Organic Act, he has the sole power to not only see who's not paying their taxes, but to enforce it. And his powers of enforcement for tax collections are very broad. And I always ask people, I say, you know, if the governor himself picked up the phone and called somebody who wasn't paying, and when I say somebody, I mean someone who owes $200, $300, $500, $1 million, $2 million in unpaid taxes. If he called them up and said, you better pay, or I'm going to come down there myself with my police detail, and if my power is vested in me by the Organic Act of Guam, I'm going to enforce these tax collections as a tax commissioner. If he did that, we would bring in those taxes, Mr. Speaker. And if he did that maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times, and everyone realized that this collections environment was serious, people would start paying. Case in point is the introduction of the tax stamp bill, where all of a sudden we're bringing in $1 million more a month in cigarette tax revenue because the stamps are coming. When we improve the collection environment, not only does that bring in the money we need for prior year obligations, it levels the playing field for businesses. It levels the playing field for our citizens. Because we have honest taxpayers who pay their taxes. And they shoulder the burdens of this government by doing their civic duty and paying what they owe. And that money is what's used to keep this government running. And when we allow some people to not do that, we are not only creating an unlevel playing field in the business community because business A might not have to be paying their taxes, but business B is. We're also creating an unlevel playing field with respect to the services we're providing the citizens of this community. Because taxpayer A is paying for the services of this government and taxpayer B is being allowed to get away with it. And so one of the biggest struggles that we have in this environment of separation of powers is how does this legislature impact the ability to enforce the law when that is clearly not within our branch of government? And one of the very few ways that we can is by altering the mandates or the circumstances within which cash is supposed to be brought in. We can affect tax law at the local level and adjust the schedule at which taxes are to be paid. GRT used to be paid quarterly, now it's paid monthly. Or we can entertain resolutions like this, where we go to the federal government and we say, we're asking you to change the way cash comes in so that you can help us. Help us. We're not begging like children. We are acknowledging the responsibilities that we have to our taxpayers, and we're acknowledging the fact that while we may not be able to enforce the law, we can certainly do what's within our realm to make sure the money is going to be there when it's supposed to. I will, at any day of the week, put my pride aside to make sure that the money that our people are supposed to be getting is going to be there for the purposes to which we are intended. And that is what this resolution represents. Because by making these payments broken down into a quarterly basis over the course of a fiscal year, we will make sure that it doesn't get all spent at once. And in so doing, the after effect of that and the need to bring in those collections in order to make sure that the money is going to be there for prior year obligations will, as a domino effect, cause our taxpayers to have a more fair taxpayer environment where less people are being allowed to get away with not paying their taxes. $150 million, Mr. Speaker, in uncollected taxes. An $80 million turnaround from the last time we brought it down. And just for the record, to be very, very clear, so that no one in the public thinks that we're not being diligent on our duty, this body cannot see who is not paying. That information is shielded, and only the governor and whoever he designates can see that. When we don't collect, we have no money for prior year obligations. And all of a sudden, we victimize the taxpayer twice, because not only are we making the honest ones pay while the dishonest ones are not, we're taking their Section 30 money and using it to make up for the prior year obligations that were unfunded by those dishonest taxpayers. And then we're turning around and we're not paying the vendor who paid his taxes. We're not giving the tax refund to the taxpayer who paid their taxes. I mean, we're compounding the victimization of our people. And all we got to do is pass a resolution and hopefully get a result from the federal government that can bring an end to that, at least a great deal. And in all those realities, it's no wonder no one wants to come down and testify, because then the questions will get asked. Where are you on collections? Why are you falling behind? How is it that we have a statute of limitations and there's no urgency? You know, if you don't pay your taxes and 10 years lapses, you're free and clear. I always remind people that one of the reasons why being elected governor is such a lucrative proposition is because if you get 2 terms, that's already 8 years. You help the guy coming in, and you could probably have an entire group of people escape the taxes that they're supposed to be paying. And all that does is set our community back. It deprives us of the resources we need to provide the services to our people. And the list is so long. We're talking about raising taxes for roads, raising taxes for the hospital, borrowing for a number of different reasons. But nobody is collecting. I do have another measure, by the way, Mr. Speaker, to try and get a report on that on a regular basis. But I don't want to deviate from the resolution. Because as we try to bring in the money we're supposed to, this resolution will also make sure that the money that's supposed to be there is there. And that we're not taking tax refund money to cover the difference because it's already been spent. Or we're not making a vendor wait 30, 60, 90, 180, 360 days for their payment because the money isn't there. Our duty is not only to budget, but to, when aware, do everything we can within our power to make sure the money for what we budget for is going to be there. And so I humbly ask my colleagues, all pride aside, let's fix this for our people and pass this resolution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. On the motion? Oh. Okay. I saw another hand go up. Senator, a question, or is it? No. Okay. On the motion to send the resolution to the voting file? Senator Nicholas, you still have the floor with 107.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pass Resolution 107 on file.
We considering now Resolution 164-34. Senator Lee, you're recognized. Oh, we'll take a short recess. Legislature is back in session. Senator Lee, you're recognized.
Sujus Masi, Mr. Speaker, I move that Resolution 164-34 be referred back to the Committee on Rules.
Thank you. On the motion? On the motion to refer the bill back to, the resolution back to committee. Any objection? It's not debatable. Any objection? There's an objection. All those in favor of referring the bill back to committee, please raise your hand. Motion passes. A short recess, I understand. Just a recess. Thank you. Mr. Majority Leader, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I move to go back to motions.
Any objection? Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, notwithstanding the House rules, I would like to play from the Committee on Education, Finance, and Taxation. I would like to place the nomination of Cesar L. Garcia to serve on the Guam Banking and Insurance Board as the Insurance Business Officer Representative, and to insert that on the session agenda.
Any objection? Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place, notwithstanding the House rules, from the Committee on Health, Tourism, Military Affairs, and Senior Citizens, I move to place the nomination of Pete A. Meno to serve on the Guam Board of Social Work as a social worker member, and to place that appointment on the session agenda.
Any objection? Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the House rules, from the Committee on Health, Tourism, Military Affairs, and Senior Citizens, I move to place the nomination of Vicente P. Flores to serve on the Department of Parks and Recreation's Board of Commissioners, to serve as a member, and to place that nomination on the session agenda.
Any objection?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Notwithstanding the House rules, from the Committee on Health, Tourism, Military Affairs, and Senior Citizens, I move to place the appointment of Mr. Eloy S. Lizama to serve on the Guam Memorial Hospital Authority Board of Trustees as a member, and to place that nomination, insert that nomination on the session agenda.
Any objection?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to place also those 4 nominations into the voting file.
Any objection to place all 4 nominations in the voting file?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Having exhausted the agenda, let's recess until 4 tomorrow afternoon to allow for engrossment and voting. Okay? Thank you.